Hey guys, tonight, we're traveling into the surprisingly strange world of medieval desserts. When you hear the word dessert, you probably imagine chocolate cake, warm cookies, sweet pastries, or creamy ice cream. But if you had wandered into a medieval bakery hundreds of years ago, you might have found something completely different. Some desserts were made with honey instead of sugar. Others were packed with expensive spices worth more than gold. And a few recipes combined sweet flavors with ingredients that modern diners would never expect to see on the same plate. The wealthy could enjoy elaborate feasts filled with colorful pastries and exotic fruits, while ordinary villagers often had to settle for simple honey cakes made only a few times each year. Even something as ordinary as a spoonful of sugar was once considered an incredible luxury, so tonight, we'll slowly explore what medieval people really considered a sweet treat, how they baked without modern ovens, why strange ingredients ended up inside their desserts, and whether any of these forgotten recipes might actually taste good today. Before we begin, if you enjoy these relaxing history journeys, consider subscribing for more stories designed to help you unwind. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. Now, make yourself comfortable, relax, and let's step inside a medieval bakery, where the sweetest treats in Europe were unlike anything you would find on a dessert table today. Imagine, for a moment, that it is early morning in a small European town. The streets are still quiet, a thin mist rests between the wooden houses, and the stones beneath your feet are damp with the coolness of the night. Somewhere nearby, a bell begins to ring, slowly calling the town toward another ordinary day. You follow the faint smell of smoke, then comes something warmer, the scent of freshly baked bread. It drifts through the narrow street from a small bakery hidden behind a timber-framed building. There is no glass display filled with neatly arranged cakes. No bright sign promises pastries inside. Instead, there is only a heavy wooden door, a little warmth escaping through the cracks, and the soft murmur of people already working within. Inside, the bakery is dim. The walls are darkened by years of smoke. Wooden shelves hold sacks of grain, baskets of dried fruit, jars of honey, and perhaps a few precious ingredients carefully stored away from dampness and hungry hands. The baker moves slowly through the room. There is flour on the table, ash near the oven, the quiet crackle of burning wood. And somewhere in the corner, a small pot holds a mixture that smells unexpectedly sweet, but sweetness, in the medieval world, was not something people could simply reach for whenever they wanted. For most people, food was about filling the stomach first. Bread mattered, porridge mattered, beans, vegetables, cheese, and whatever meat could be obtained mattered. A sweet dish was different. It belonged to a special corner of life, where ordinary ingredients could be transformed into something comforting and memorable, and that transformation was not always simple. The medieval baker had to work with ingredients that changed with the seasons. Fruits appeared briefly and then disappeared. Nuts had to be gathered and stored. Spices traveled enormous distances before reaching European kitchens. And the most important sweet ingredient of all, sugar, was still far beyond the reach of most households. This meant that medieval desserts were shaped by scarcity. A recipe might begin with something familiar, perhaps a piece of bread or a handful of grain. Then someone would add honey, a few dried fruits, perhaps a pinch of cinnamon or ginger if the household could afford it. Suddenly, the same humble ingredients that had filled an empty stomach became something special, something worth remembering, something that might appear only once a year. And perhaps that is the first secret of medieval desserts. They were not always strange because medieval people had unusual tastes. Sometimes they were strange because the world around them gave them. Very few choices, The sweetness they desired had to be gathered from forests, carried across mountains, harvested from flowers, or purchased from merchants who had traveled far beyond the familiar roads. And as the morning light slowly entered that smoky bakery, one question quietly emerged: what would happen when a society that had almost no access to sugar began to crave sweetness? The answer would lead medieval cooks toward honey, dried fruits, spices, flowers, and ingredients that seem almost forgotten now, and before long, the simple desire for something sweet would become a story of wealth, trade, imagination, and a little mystery, because the first thing we need to understand is just how difficult it once was to obtain the ingredient that now sits quietly in almost every kitchen. Sugar. And in the medieval world, sugar was not an everyday pleasure waiting on a shelf. It was a rarity, a curiosity, a taste reserved for those who could afford to chase sweetness across the distant edges of the known world. The little bakery is still warm behind us now, its smoky doorway slowly disappearing into the pale morning mist. But as we continue through the medieval town, another scent begins to follow us, something faintly sweet, not honey, not dried fruit, something rarer, something that, for most people living in Europe during the Middle Ages, might as well have come from another world: sugar. Today, it is so ordinary that we hardly notice it. It sits in bowls on kitchen tables, dissolves into tea, disappears into cakes, and hides inside countless foods. A person can walk into a shop and buy a large bag of it without giving the purchase a second thought, but imagine living in a time when sugar was not a familiar household ingredient. Imagine hearing that somewhere, far beyond your village, there was a substance that could make food astonishingly sweet. You might never see it, you might never taste it, and if you did, you might remember the experience for the rest of your life. During much of the medieval period, sugar was a luxury that reached European consumers through long and complicated trade networks. Its history in the Mediterranean stretched back to earlier civilizations, and knowledge of cultivating and processing sugarcane spread through different regions over centuries. But sugarcane was not a plant that could simply be grown everywhere. It preferred warm climates, it needed suitable soil, water, and considerable labor. The cane had to be cultivated, harvested, crushed, and processed before the sweetness inside it could become a usable product. Every stage required effort, and every journey added another layer of expense. For someone living in a cold northern village, the problem was simple: sugar did not grow nearby. There were no endless fields of cane waving gently outside the town walls. Instead, the sweet crystals had to travel, and medieval travel was slow. Ships crossed uncertain seas. Merchants moved along difficult roads. Goods passed through ports, markets, warehouses, and the hands of countless traders before reaching their final destination. By the time sugar arrived in a European market, it had already traveled a remarkable distance. That journey was reflected in its price. For the ordinary medieval family, there were far more practical things to spend money on: grain, clothing, firewood, salt, tools. A small quantity of sugar could represent a luxury far removed from everyday necessities. So when medieval cooks wanted to create sweetness, they usually looked closer to home. Honey was the obvious answer. Bees could be kept near farms, monasteries, and estates. Wild honey could sometimes be collected from forests and hollow trees. It was familiar, useful, and naturally sweet, but sugar had something honey did not: it could be stored in a concentrated form. It had a different texture, and to those who could afford it, sugar represented something exotic, something that seemed to belong to distant lands. In wealthy households, it gradually found a place in sophisticated kitchens. Physicians sometimes considered it valuable for medicinal purposes. Apothecaries used sweet substances in preparations. Cooks experimented with it in dishes that blurred the boundaries between food and medicine. A spoonful might be carefully measured, a small quantity might be mixed into a special preparation. Nothing was wasted, nothing was casually sprinkled over a dish. That casual relationship with sugar belonged to a much later world. For the medieval cook, sweetness required thought. You might have a small jar containing sugar that had taken months to arrive. Perhaps it had been purchased by a wealthy household and locked away with other valuable ingredients. The cook would know exactly how much remained. A little for one recipe, a little for another, and perhaps, if the household was preparing for an important feast, a portion would be reserved for something truly impressive. This scarcity also shaped the imagination of medieval dessert makers. When an ingredient is easy to obtain, it becomes ordinary. When it is rare, people begin to dream about it. Sugar appeared in the world of luxury precisely because it was difficult to possess. Its sweetness carried the flavor of distance, wealth, and privilege. For the poor, sweetness remained closely connected to the natural world. Honey from bees, apples stored through winter, pears dried beneath the sun, plums preserved for colder months, berries gathered during the brief abundance of summer. These ingredients were not necessarily simple in the emotional sense. A child eating a honey cake at a village celebration might have no idea how wealthy nobles were using imported sugar. The child only knew that the cake was sweet, that it was soft, that it was special, and sometimes that was enough. Still, there was one sweetener that had been quietly waiting in European landscapes for centuries. It did not need to cross oceans, it did not require distant merchants, and it could be gathered by people living far from royal courts. All it needed was a flowering meadow, a warm afternoon, and thousands of tiny wings. Honey was about to become the true king of the medieval sweet tooth, and in the golden glow of the beehives, the story of medieval dessert would begin to take on a sweeter, stranger shape. The tiny bees are still moving lazily through the flowers beside the village cottage. Their quiet buzzing almost disappears beneath the evening air, and if you were standing there in the medieval countryside, watching them come and go, you might not have realized that these small creatures were responsible for one of the most precious sources of sweetness available to ordinary people. Honey. Long before sugar became an everyday ingredient, honey had already been part of human life for thousands of years. Medieval Europeans inherited a deep knowledge of beekeeping from earlier generations, and wherever flowers grew, people understood that sweetness might be waiting nearby. But honey was never simply poured from a supermarket jar. Its journey began with bees. In a medieval village, you might find hives near a garden, beside a monastery, or close to the fields surrounding a manor. Some hives were simple woven containers made from straw, while others were constructed from wood or clay. The beekeeper had to approach carefully. Bees were useful, but they were not gentle. A disturbed hive could suddenly become a cloud of angry wings. Smoke was often used to calm the insects, allowing the beekeeper to work with less danger. Slowly, carefully, honeycomb could be removed and the sweet substance collected. The result was more than a dessert ingredient. Honey could sweeten food, it could help preserve certain ingredients. It could be used in drinks, it could appear in medicinal preparations, and, perhaps most importantly, it was locally available in a world where long-distance trade was difficult and expensive. That made honey very different from sugar. A village might not have a merchant arriving from a distant port with exotic goods, but it might have bees. The landscape itself could provide sweetness, and the flavor of that sweetness depended on the landscape. Honey gathered from wildflowers could taste different from honey collected near orchards or fields. The flowers visited by the bees quietly influenced what ended up in the pot. Imagine a medieval summer meadow. The grass is tall, Small flowers move gently in the breeze. Bees travel from one blossom to another, carrying tiny traces of the countryside back to their hive. Weeks later, the honey they produce might become part of a family meal. In that sense, a medieval dessert could contain something almost like a memory of the landscape. The flowers of spring, the warmth of summer, the scent of an orchard, all of it concentrated into a golden sweetness. But honey had its limitations. It was valuable, it required work, and harvesting too much could threaten the colony that produced it. Medieval beekeepers therefore had to balance human desire with the survival of the bees. This was especially important because bees were not simply sources of food. Wax was enormously useful. It could be made into candles, and candles were essential for churches, monasteries, wealthy homes, and anyone who needed light after sunset, so a healthy hive could provide two valuable resources at once: honey for sweetness, wax for light. The connection between bees and monasteries became particularly important in many parts of medieval Europe. Monastic communities often maintained gardens, orchards, and beehives. Their kitchens needed supplies, while their religious buildings required candles. The humble bee quietly served both needs. Inside a monastery kitchen, honey might be stirred into a thick mixture over a fire. It could be combined with grains, fruits, nuts, or spices. Perhaps the cook was preparing something for a feast. Perhaps it was simply a small treat for someone who had spent the day working. The recipe might never have been written down. This is one of the mysteries surrounding medieval food. Much of what ordinary people ate was never recorded in elegant manuscripts. Recipes were often passed from one generation to another through memory and habit. A grandmother might know exactly how much honey belonged in a mixture. A baker might recognize the correct texture without measuring anything. A cook could tell by smell when a dish was ready. The knowledge lived in hands and senses rather than books, and because of this, countless humble desserts have disappeared. We know that honey was used. We know that sweetened breads, cakes, pastries, fruits, and other preparations existed, but the exact details of an ordinary family's favorite recipe may have vanished forever. Perhaps somewhere, centuries ago, a child tasted a warm honey cake for the first time. The cake was probably not elaborate. It may have been dense. It may have been unevenly baked. There may have been no beautiful decoration, but to that child, it was something extraordinary, because sweetness was not always about abundance. Sometimes its power came from rarity. A little honey could turn an ordinary meal into a moment worth remembering. And yet, even with honey available, not everyone had equal access to it. The richest households had more hives, more land, more skilled workers, and more opportunities to transform sweetness into elaborate dishes. For the poorest families, honey might still be precious enough to save for special occasions. So as we leave the quiet village hive behind, another question begins to emerge: if honey was the great sweetener of the medieval world, who actually had enough of it to enjoy dessert whenever they wished? The answer leads us away from the buzzing fields and toward the stone halls of castles, where sweetness could become a visible sign of wealth, and there, behind heavy wooden doors, the humble honey cake would begin to share the table with something far more extravagant. The monastery kitchen fades behind us, the smell of warm honey slowly disappears into the cool evening air, and the narrow path beneath our feet leads toward a larger settlement. Ahead, the landscape changes, the cottages become fewer, the road becomes wider, and rising above the distant rooftops, we begin to see the towers of a medieval castle. Inside those thick stone walls, another world is waiting. A world where sweetness could be measured not only by taste, but by wealth, because in the medieval world, having dessert was rarely just a matter of wanting something sweet. It was a matter of having access to land, access to money, access to trade, and sometimes access to people who could spend an entire day preparing a dish that would be eaten in only a few minutes. For most medieval families, the idea of a separate dessert course would have been unfamiliar. Meals were generally built around what could be grown, gathered, raised, or purchased locally. Bread was central, grains filled stomachs, vegetables and legumes provided nourishment, cheese, eggs, fish, or meat appeared according to season, location, religious customs, and household resources. Sweet foods existed, but they were not necessarily served at the end of every meal. A piece of fruit might be eaten whenever it was available. A little honey could be spread onto bread. Dried fruits could be saved for winter, but a specially prepared sweet dish required something extra. It required time, ingredients, fuel for the fire, and someone with the skill to prepare it. For a peasant family, these resources were precious. A poor household could not casually spend a large quantity of honey on a cake when that same honey might be useful elsewhere. The family had to think about the future. Winter was always somewhere ahead. The harvest could fail. A sick animal could create unexpected hardship. A broken tool might need replacing. Food that could be stored was valuable. Food that disappeared in a single evening was a luxury. This did not mean that ordinary people never enjoyed sweet treats. Far from it. They simply experienced sweetness differently. A family might gather wild berries during summer. They could dry apples and pears. They might preserve plums or other fruits when the harvest was generous. If they kept bees, honey could become part of special recipes, and when a wedding, harvest celebration, or religious festival arrived, these ingredients could be brought together. The result might be simple, but deeply meaningful. A sweet cake shared by an entire village could have greater emotional importance than an elaborate dessert served every evening in a wealthy castle, because when something is rare, people remember it. Inside a noble household, however, the situation was very different. A wealthy lord might control large areas of farmland. The estate could produce grain, fruits, dairy products, and livestock. Workers maintained orchards. Servants cared for animals. Kitchen staff prepared meals, and merchants brought goods from distant markets. The castle kitchen became a world of its own. It could be noisy during the day, filled with the sounds of chopping, grinding, boiling, roasting, and baking. Huge pots hung over fires. Bread ovens glowed. Servants carried heavy trays through corridors. And somewhere among all this activity, cooks worked with ingredients that most villagers would rarely see. Sugar, when available, was especially valuable. Spices from distant lands could be expensive. Dried fruits might have traveled considerable distances. Nuts, fine flour, imported ingredients, and carefully prepared preserves all reflected the purchasing power of the household. The wealthy could afford experimentation. That may be one of the most important differences between medieval rich and poor. When you have limited ingredients, you learn to use what you have efficiently. When you have money, you can afford to try something unusual. A cook could combine several expensive ingredients simply to create a dish that would surprise guests. The dessert did not need to be practical, it needed to be memorable. At a noble feast, sweetness could become a form of theater. A pastry might be shaped into an elaborate design. Fruit could be arranged carefully. Spices could fill the room with unfamiliar aromas. And sugar, when present, could signal that the household had connections reaching far beyond its own fields. But wealth did not guarantee constant indulgence. Even the richest medieval households lived in a world where preservation was difficult, transportation was slow, and seasons determined what was available. A castle could have money and influence, but it still depended upon harvests. and the most luxurious ingredients could disappear when trade routes were disrupted or supplies became scarce. So perhaps the medieval dessert table was not simply divided between rich and poor. Instead, it existed on a long spectrum. At one end, a child receiving a small piece of honey cake; at the other, a noble guest being presented with an elaborate sweet creation made from ingredients gathered from across distant lands. Between them were merchants, craftsmen, monks, prosperous farmers, and town families, each enjoying sweetness according to what their own circumstances allowed. And somewhere in the middle of this world stood another important figure, the person who transformed all those ingredients into something edible, the medieval baker. Behind the warm ovens and smoke-darkened walls, bakers worked with fire that could not be controlled by turning a dial. They judged temperature by experience, they learned through mistakes, and sometimes they created something unexpectedly delicious. Other times, something strange. To understand medieval desserts, we must now step into that bakery and watch how these cooks and bakers actually worked, because before the first bite could ever reach the table, there was a much greater challenge waiting: the oven itself. The castle towers are fading into the distance now, and the road carries us back toward the town, where the first light of morning is beginning to touch the rooftops. Somewhere ahead, a door opens, warm air escapes into the cold street. There is the smell of flour, smoke, burning wood, and something faintly sweet, hidden beneath the stronger scent of freshly baked bread. We have arrived at the bakery. From the outside, it might not look like a remarkable place. The building is narrow, perhaps made of timber and stone, with a heavy wooden door and small windows. There may be no elegant sign announcing what lies within, but step through that door, and suddenly, the quiet medieval street disappears. Inside, the bakery is alive, not with chaos, but with constant movement. A baker bends over a wooden table, a servant carries a basket of grain, someone feeds another piece of wood into the oven, a child perhaps waits near the doorway, hoping for a small piece of leftover dough. The room is warm, the air is thick with flour, and everywhere there are traces of work. This is where medieval baking becomes fascinating, because the baker has no thermometer, no electric mixer, no carefully calibrated oven, no timer sitting on the wall. The tools are simple, the knowledge is not. The most important piece of equipment is the oven itself. Some medieval ovens were built from brick or stone, often designed to retain heat after a fire had burned inside. The baker had to understand the behavior of that heat through experience. Too hot, and the outside of the bread might burn before the inside was properly cooked. Too cool, and the dough might remain heavy and underbaked. There was no convenient number telling the baker that the oven had reached the perfect temperature. Instead, experience became the thermometer. A baker could observe the fire, feel the warmth, watch the color of the oven interior, learn how long the heat remained after the flames were removed. Every bakery developed its own rhythm, and that rhythm began long before the first loaf entered the oven. Grain had to be prepared, flour had to be milled, water had to be carried, wood had to be gathered, ingredients had to be measured. Even when exact measurements were often based on experience rather than standardized scales, the process was physical, heavy, repetitive, and yet, somewhere within all this ordinary labor, medieval bakers created their sweet foods. Some were simple, others were surprisingly elaborate. Bread itself could become part of a sweet preparation. A stale loaf might be transformed rather than thrown away. Dried fruits could be added. Honey could provide sweetness. Milk or eggs might enrich the mixture when available. Spices could bring an entirely different fragrance. The medieval kitchen was often a place where nothing useful was wasted. This was especially true when food was expensive. A cook might look at yesterday's bread and see not rubbish, but possibility. Perhaps it could be soaked, perhaps it could be mixed with other ingredients, perhaps it could be baked again. The boundary between bread, pastry, pudding, and dessert was not always as clear as it is today. This is one reason medieval food can seem strange to modern eyes. We have become accustomed to separating meals into categories: breakfast, lunch, dinner, dessert. But medieval cooks were often more flexible. A sweetened dish might appear alongside other foods. A pastry might contain both savory and sweet ingredients. A fruit preparation might be served as part of a larger meal. And something that we would immediately call dessert might have been considered simply another special food. The bakery itself also had a social role. In some medieval communities, not everyone baked their own bread. Shared or commercial ovens could become important parts of town life. People brought dough to be baked. They waited, they talked, they exchanged news. The smell of bread drifting through the streets became part of the daily atmosphere of the town. For children, the bakery might be especially magical. Imagine standing outside on a cold morning, wrapped in a rough woolen garment, watching steam rise from the doorway. You cannot see everything happening inside, but you can smell it: the warm bread, the smoke, the faint sweetness. Perhaps you wonder what is being prepared. Maybe there is a honey cake inside, maybe a fruit-filled pastry, maybe something far stranger. And that mystery is part of the charm, because the medieval baker was not simply following recipes printed in a book. Many recipes were passed down through practice. A cook learned by watching, by touching, by tasting, by making mistakes. One batch might be too dry, another might collapse, a third might emerge from the oven unexpectedly wonderful. And sometimes, necessity itself created new recipes. A shortage of one ingredient encouraged the use of another. A surplus of fruit inspired preservation. An expensive spice was used sparingly, perhaps changing the entire character of a dish. Slowly, over generations, these experiments became traditions, and so the medieval bakery was more than a place where bread was produced. It was a laboratory of ordinary people, a place where hunger met imagination, where scarcity encouraged creativity, and where the desire for sweetness could turn humble ingredients into something unforgettable. But as we look more closely at the wooden shelves around us, another question appears: what exactly was hiding inside those bowls? Because medieval cooks had access to ingredients that would seem perfectly familiar today, and others that might make us pause. Some were fragrant, some were unusual, and a few were so unexpected that the modern dessert table would probably never welcome them. The next mystery is waiting in the pantry, among the strange ingredients that medieval cooks believed could make their sweet dishes even better. The bakery door closes softly behind us, and for a moment, the sounds of the street disappear. We are back inside the warm, smoky kitchen. The stone oven is glowing. The wooden table is covered with flour, and along the shelves, hidden inside clay jars, woven baskets, and small wooden boxes, are the ingredients that gave medieval desserts their unusual character. Some are familiar: honey, apples, pears, nuts, but others are less expected. Because medieval cooks did not always think about sweetness in the same way we do today. When we imagine dessert, we often imagine sweetness as the main purpose of the dish. Medieval cooks could be more flexible. They understood that flavors could exist together: sweet and sour, sweet and bitter, sweet and spicy, and sometimes sweet and savory. This made the medieval kitchen a fascinating place. A cook might begin with something simple, such as dried fruit, then perhaps add honey, a handful of nuts, a pinch of spice, and something sour to balance the sweetness. The result could be unfamiliar to a modern palate, yet perfectly reasonable to someone living centuries ago. One ingredient that appears repeatedly in historical food traditions is rosewater. The delicate fragrance of roses had long been associated with luxury and refinement across different cultures, and rosewater eventually became part of some medieval European culinary traditions. Imagine opening a small ceramic vessel in a wealthy kitchen. Inside is a clear, fragrant liquid. Only a little is needed. A few drops might be added to a sweet preparation, giving it a floral aroma. Suddenly, the dish smells different, not like the fruit or honey alone. There is something softer, almost like walking through a garden after rain. Another unusual ingredient was almond. Almonds were especially valuable in many medieval kitchens, particularly during periods when religious dietary rules restricted certain animal products. They could be ground into a fine paste. The paste could be sweetened, it could be shaped, it could be used to thicken mixtures, and it could create textures that were surprisingly sophisticated for someone accustomed to modern desserts. A medieval almond-based sweet might seem familiar in one moment and strange in the next. The sweetness is recognizable, but the flavor is deeper, the texture heavier, the fragrance more subtle. Then there were spices: cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, pepper. These ingredients traveled long distances and could be extremely valuable. But medieval cooks did not necessarily use spices only because they wanted food to taste sweet. Spices added complexity. A little cinnamon could transform a fruit dish, ginger could bring warmth, cloves could create an intense fragrance, and pepper, which modern diners might associate primarily with savory meals, could appear in preparations that combine several contrasting flavors. Imagine a cook standing over a wooden bowl. The ingredients are already mixed, the honey has been added, the fruit is soft, then comes the spice, only a small amount. The cook pauses, the aroma rises. Suddenly, the kitchen smells warmer, richer, more mysterious. There were also ingredients that modern people might not immediately associate with dessert. Cheese, for example, could appear alongside sweet foods. Milk-based preparations could be sweetened, eggs might help create rich mixtures, and bread could be transformed into something entirely different from the loaf that first emerged from the oven. The medieval cook was not necessarily interested in keeping every ingredient inside a strict category. Food was food. If something was available, useful, and suitable for the dish, it could be considered. This practical attitude was partly shaped by necessity. Waste was expensive. A household could not afford to throw away perfectly usable ingredients simply because they did not fit our modern idea of dessert. A piece of stale bread could become the foundation of another dish. Leftover fruit could be preserved. Nuts could be stored. Milk could be turned into cheese. Eggs could enrich a recipe. Nothing existed in isolation. Everything belonged to a larger system of survival. And then there were the ingredients that would have seemed truly exotic. Certain fruits arrived from distant regions. Imported spices crossed seas and mountains. Sugar itself was beginning to enter elite kitchens. These ingredients carried stories of trade. A pinch of spice might represent an extraordinary journey. A small quantity of dried fruit could have passed through several markets before reaching a noble household. The medieval dessert was therefore connected to a much larger world than the kitchen itself. Every unfamiliar flavor hinted at distant places. Foreign merchants, unknown landscapes, long roads, restless seas. And perhaps this is why some medieval desserts seem so strange to us. They were created at a time when the boundaries between familiar and exotic were constantly shifting. A cook could stand in a small stone kitchen and combine ingredients that had grown within walking distance with others that had traveled hundreds or thousands of miles. The result was a dish that belonged to both worlds, the local and the distant. But among all these ingredients, there was one group that carried a special kind of fascination. Fruits, they could be gathered from nearby trees, dried for winter, preserved in honey, or transported across enormous distances, and depending on where you lived. The simple sight of a particular fruit might tell you something about your place in medieval society, because some fruits were ordinary, and others were almost treasures. The next time we enter the medieval kitchen, we will discover why a handful of fruit could become a symbol of wealth, status, and desire, and why the sweetest flavors were sometimes the ones that had traveled the farthest. The spice jars remain behind us now, their fragrant secrets resting quietly on the wooden shelves as we step away from the kitchen and into the cool night air above the rooftops. The sky has darkened, a few stars appear between drifting clouds, and somewhere beyond the town walls, hidden among orchards and fields, are the fruits that gave medieval cooks another way to create sweetness. At first, fruit may seem like the simplest dessert imaginable: an apple, a pear, a handful of berries. Nothing particularly strange about that, but in the medieval world, the value of fruit depended greatly on where you lived, what season it was, and how far you were from the place where that fruit had grown. A fruit that was ordinary in one region could become a luxury hundreds of miles away, and a fruit that appeared only for a few weeks each year could become something precious when winter arrived. Imagine standing in a medieval orchard during autumn. The air is cool, leaves drift slowly from the branches, the last apples hang heavily from the trees, their skins marked by the weather. Workers move quietly between the rows, gathering the harvest into wooden baskets. For a farming family, this was not merely a pleasant afternoon. The harvest had to be protected. Some fruit could be eaten immediately, some could be stored, some could be dried, and some might be transformed into preserves that could survive the colder months. This was one of the great secrets of medieval sweetness, preservation. The medieval world did not have refrigerators. There were no freezers waiting in a kitchen. Fresh fruit had a short life. Once picked, it began to change, so people learned to extend its usefulness. Apples and pears could be stored carefully. Plums and other fruits could be dried. Berries could be preserved in various ways. Fruit might be cooked down into thick mixtures. Honey could help protect and sweeten certain preparations. These techniques meant that the taste of summer could sometimes survive long after the fields had become brown and silent. But not every fruit was equally common. Some were closely connected to the local climate, others traveled through trade networks. This is where the medieval dessert table begins. To become more interesting, dried fruits, such as raisins, could be particularly valuable in regions where grapes were not easily grown. Imagine a merchant opening a wooden chest in a crowded medieval marketplace. Inside are small dried fruits, dark and wrinkled from the journey. They may not look impressive, but they have survived transportation. They can be stored, they can be carried, and they can bring sweetness into a kitchen far from the vineyards where the grapes originally grew. To a wealthy household, such ingredients offered possibilities. A cook could add them to pastries, mix them with nuts, combine them with spices, or scatter them through a sweetened preparation. The dried fruit itself might be small, but its presence could change an entire dish. Then there were fruits that became symbols of luxury because they were difficult to cultivate in colder climates. Citrus fruits, for example, were associated with warmer regions and could be difficult to obtain in parts of northern Europe. Their arrival could be remarkable. Imagine seeing a bright golden or orange-colored fruit in the middle of a medieval winter. Outside, the trees are bare, the fields are pale with frost, the air is cold enough to sting the hands, and yet, inside a wealthy household, there is a fruit carrying the color and scent of warmer lands. It would have seemed almost magical, not necessarily because people believed it was supernatural, but because it represented distance, a taste of somewhere else. The same was true of other imported or regionally scarce fruits. Their value was not simply nutritional, they carried prestige. Serving unusual fruit to guests could demonstrate that a household had wealth and connections. It suggested access to merchants, access to transportation, access to places beyond the immediate horizon. This was especially important during large feasts. A table filled with familiar foods could feed many people, but a table containing rare fruits could impress them. The fruit itself became part of the performance. And yet, the medieval relationship with fruit was not always luxurious. For ordinary people, fruit remained part of the rhythm of the countryside. A child might pick an apple directly from a tree, a family might gather blackberries along a hedgerow, a farmer could store pears for later. These experiences were simple, but even here, scarcity shaped behavior. When fruit was abundant, people had to act quickly. They gathered, sorted, stored, dried, preserved. The goal was to carry the harvest forward, because winter had a way of making yesterday's abundance feel very distant. Months after the last autumn apple had been collected, a family might open a carefully stored container of dried fruit. The portion would be small, perhaps too small for modern expectations, but the sweetness would remain, a quiet reminder of warmer days, and perhaps this explains why fruit became so important to medieval desserts. It could exist at every level of society. The poorest person might gather wild berries, a farmer might preserve apples, a merchant might sell dried grapes, a noble household might display exotic fruit imported from distant regions. The same basic idea, sweetness from nature, could take countless forms, but as we move deeper into the medieval kitchen, the fruit begins to meet another group of ingredients: small, hard, fragrant, and sometimes surprisingly expensive, nuts and seeds. And when medieval cooks combined them with spices, honey, and preserved fruit, they created mixtures that could be transformed into some of the most distinctive sweet foods of their age. The orchard is growing quiet now, the last leaves are falling, and somewhere in the darkness, a basket of harvested fruit waits patiently for the next morning, when the medieval cook will open it and begin adding something a little more mysterious. The orchard is quiet now, the last leaves have settled onto the ground, and the baskets of fruit have been carried indoors, away from the cold. But the medieval cook is not finished. On the wooden table, beside the preserved apples and dried fruits, are smaller ingredients: a handful of almonds, some walnuts, tiny seeds, and several dark, fragrant spices waiting inside little wooden containers. They may look ordinary when placed side by side, but in the medieval kitchen, these ingredients could change everything. Nuts were especially useful because they could be stored for long periods. An apple might eventually rot, a berry would spoil quickly, but a carefully dried nut could survive through the winter, waiting patiently until someone needed it. For a medieval household, that made nuts valuable. They were nourishing, they were versatile, and when combined with honey or dried fruit, they could become part of something distinctly sweet. Almonds were particularly important in medieval cooking. They could be ground into a fine powder or paste, creating a rich texture that could be used in many different preparations. A cook might begin with whole almonds. The nuts would be crushed, then crushed again, slowly. The rough pieces would become finer until they formed a soft mixture. Add honey, perhaps some rosewater, maybe a little spice, and suddenly, something entirely different had appeared. There was no need for modern chocolate, no need for refined cream. The medieval cook could create richness from what was available. Almonds also had another advantage: they could sometimes take the place of ingredients that were restricted during religious fasting periods. Medieval religious calendars included many days when certain animal products were limited or avoided. this created an interesting challenge for cooks. They still needed to prepare satisfying food. So ingredients such as almonds became extremely useful. A bowl of almond-based food could provide nourishment while also offering a texture that felt rich and indulgent, and perhaps this is where medieval dessert begins to blur into something else. Food could be practical and luxurious. At the same time, the same almond mixture might appear in different contexts depending on the household preparing it. Then there were seeds. Some were used for flavor, others for texture. Certain seeds could be added to breads and pastries, creating tiny bursts of taste beneath the teeth. They were small ingredients, but medieval cooks understood that even a small addition could change the character of an entire dish. And then came the spices. These were perhaps the most mysterious ingredients in the medieval pantry: cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg, pepper. To modern eyes, a spice jar is simply another object in the kitchen, but imagine a medieval cook opening one. The fragrance escapes immediately, warm, sharp, intense. The smell alone might suggest another world. Many spices came from far beyond Europe. They traveled through complex networks of merchants and traders. Before reaching a medieval kitchen, they might have passed through markets, ports, warehouses, and the hands of numerous people. A tiny amount could represent a surprisingly long journey. This distance gave spices a special status. They were not simply seasonings, they were reminders of wealth and connection. A noble household that could regularly use imported spices demonstrated access to a wider commercial world. Yet spices were not always used heavily. A cook might use only a small amount. Too much could overwhelm the other flavors. The skill was in balance. Imagine a wooden bowl filled with chopped dried fruit. Honey is slowly stirred through it. Ground almonds are added, then a small pinch of cinnamon. The cook pauses, a little ginger, another pause, perhaps one crushed clove. The mixture is stirred again. The aroma begins to rise. Sweetness is no longer alone. It now has warmth, depth, a faint sharpness, and something difficult to identify. This was part of the medieval fascination with spices. They could make familiar ingredients seem unfamiliar. An ordinary apple could become something more mysterious. A simple honey mixture could suddenly feel luxurious. A handful of nuts could be transformed into a dish worthy of a special occasion. And because spices were often expensive, their use could also communicate status. A feast did not need enormous quantities of spice. Sometimes the fragrance was enough. Guests could smell it before they tasted it. The scent drifting across a banquet table quietly announced that the household had access to something special. Yet there is another reason nuts and spices mattered. They helped medieval cooks create variety. When sugar was scarce and fresh fruit was seasonal, these ingredients gave cooks new ways to change the same basic foods. The same dried fruit could taste different when combined with cinnamon. The same honey could feel richer when mixed with almonds. A simple pastry could become completely transformed by the addition of ginger. The kitchen became a place of subtle experimentation. And perhaps one of the most interesting things about these ingredients is how familiar they remain. Even today, we recognize the combination of nuts, dried fruit, honey, and spice. Some medieval flavors have survived remarkably well, but the medieval cook was not always interested in creating something small and delicate. Sometimes these ingredients were placed inside something much larger, something wrapped in pastry, something baked until golden, something that could conceal almost anything beneath its crust, the sweet pie. And as the cook reaches for a wooden rolling pin, the quiet pantry gives way to the sound of dough being pressed across the table. Soon, beneath that simple crust, a medieval mystery will be waiting. The spices are still lingering in the air: cinnamon, ginger, cloves, and nutmeg resting quietly on the wooden table as the medieval cook turns toward another familiar ingredient: flour, water, fat, and thyme. These simple things, when brought together with a little patience, could create something that has survived for centuries. The pie. Today, we usually think of a pie as a clearly defined dessert, a golden crust, a sweet filling. Perhaps apples bubbling beneath the pastry, but in the medieval kitchen, the boundary between sweet and savory was far less certain. A pie was not necessarily a dessert, it was a container. The pastry held whatever the cook wanted to place inside. Meat, fish, vegetables, fruit, nuts, spices, sometimes several flavors could appear together in ways that might seem unusual today. The pastry itself was often practical. It protected the filling. It helped food survive transportation. It could be baked into a sturdy shell that was sometimes more important as a cooking vessel than something meant to be eaten. But gradually, sweet fillings found their place inside these crusts. Imagine a medieval kitchen on a cool afternoon. A cook stands beside a wooden table. A bowl of apples waits nearby. Some have been peeled, others are being sliced with a small knife. Beside them are dried fruits, chopped nuts, honey, and spices. The ingredients are simple enough, but the cook knows that once they are enclosed beneath pastry and exposed to heat, they will become something completely different. The dough is rolled, not perfectly. There are no machines to create an identical sheet every time. The cook uses experience. The pastry is lifted carefully. Perhaps it tears. Perhaps a little flour is scattered across the table. The work continues. The filling is placed inside. Apples, pears, dried fruit, a little honey, maybe a pinch of spice. The top layer is added, and now the strange transformation begins. The pie disappears into the oven. For a while, nothing can be seen, only the smell begins to change. At first, there is the scent of warm flour, then fruit, then spice. Slowly, the aroma moves through the kitchen. Someone passing outside might stop for a moment. Perhaps a child standing in the street catches the smell. The child cannot see what is inside the oven, but the scent tells a story. Something special is being prepared. This was part of the magic of medieval baking. The ingredients themselves could be humble, but heat changed them. Time changed them, and pastry concealed them until the moment of serving. When the pie finally emerged, it might not look like the perfect pastries we see today. The crust could be uneven, the edges might be rough, the surface might crack, but beneath that golden exterior was a warm mixture of fruit, honey, nuts, and spice. For a medieval household, that could be a remarkable pleasure, and pies were not limited to the tables of the wealthy. Different versions could appear at different levels of society. A noble kitchen might produce an elaborate pastry filled with expensive ingredients. A prosperous household might make a fruit pie during harvest season. A village family might create something much simpler using whatever fruit was available. The basic idea remained the same. Take what the land provides, place it inside dough, and make it last a little longer. This was particularly useful during fruit harvests. When apples or pears became abundant, a family had to decide how to preserve them. Eating everything immediately was impossible. Some fruit would be stored, some dried, and some could be turned into cooked fillings. The pie offered another possibility. It transformed seasonal abundance into something that could be enjoyed as a special meal. The spices added another layer. Imagine biting into a warm piece of fruit pie. The first taste is sweet, then comes the gentle warmth of cinnamon. Perhaps ginger follows, a tiny hint of clove lingers at the end. These flavors would have been familiar to medieval cooks, but their combination could still feel luxurious, and sometimes the most interesting medieval pies were not purely sweet. A cook might combine fruit with meat, A sweet filling might sit beside savory ingredients. The result could be difficult for modern diners to categorize. Was it a dessert, a main dish, something in between? The medieval answer might simply have been food. The modern idea that every dish must belong to one specific category was not always important. What mattered was whether it tasted good, whether it suited the occasion, and whether the ingredients were available. There is something strangely comforting about this. The medieval cook did not have access to endless choices, but within those limitations, creativity found a way forward. A few apples, a handful of dried fruit, some nuts, a little honey, a pinch of spice, and a crust. That was enough to create something that could bring warmth to a cold evening, yet pies could become far more elaborate when they entered the world of noble dining. Their pastry was no longer simply a practical container. It could become decoration, a symbol of wealth, even a form of entertainment. And as the warm smell of our simple fruit pie slowly fades, the road ahead leads toward a much larger hall, a place where medieval desserts would become part of an elaborate display of power. The humble pie is about to enter the castle, and once it reaches the noble table, almost anything becomes possible. The humble fruit pie has disappeared beneath a silver serving dish, at least in our imagination, and now the narrow village kitchen gives way to something much larger. A great wooden door opens. Beyond it lies a long stone hall, illuminated by dozens of candles. The ceiling rises high above us, supported by heavy beams darkened by years of smoke. Tapestries hang against the cold walls, their colors softened by age. At the far end of the room, musicians play quietly while servants move between the tables. Tonight, the castle is celebrating, and somewhere among the roasted meats, warm breads, fragrant spices, and overflowing cups, dessert is waiting for medieval nobles. A feast was never simply about eating. Food could communicate power, it could demonstrate generosity, it could reveal wealth, and sometimes it could make a guest feel as though they had stepped into another world. The ordinary medieval meal was concerned with nourishment. The noble banquet could be concerned with impression. A wealthy lord wanted his guests to remember the evening. Perhaps they would remember the music, the candles, the magnificent hall. But they might also remember the moment when an unusual sweet dish was carried through the doorway. Imagine the servants approaching. They move carefully. One carries a large wooden tray, another follows with a smaller dish covered by a cloth. The guests begin to look, conversation softens, the cloth is lifted, and there it is, a carefully prepared pastry, perhaps filled with preserved fruit, perhaps decorated with nuts, perhaps flavored with expensive spices, perhaps sweetened with sugar that has traveled a remarkable distance to reach this table. The dessert itself may not be enormous. That is not necessarily the point. The ingredients tell the story. Cinnamon suggests distant trade, dried fruits suggest careful preservation, almonds suggest wealth and refinement, sugar suggests access to an expensive luxury. The dessert becomes a quiet demonstration of what the household can obtain. This was particularly meaningful in a world where transportation was slow. Today, exotic ingredients can cross continents in a matter of days. In the medieval period, bringing rare goods into a household required networks of merchants, ships, animals, roads, and markets. Every ingredient had a journey, and the wealthiest households could afford to bring those journeys together on a single table. The kitchen itself would have been working for hours, perhaps even longer. Servants carried firewood, others prepared dough, someone washed fruit, another person ground spices. The cooks had to coordinate everything. A large feast could involve enormous quantities of food. The sweet dishes were only one part of it, but they were often among the most memorable. There was something about sweetness that made it particularly suitable for celebration. It was not necessary, it was not simply fuel, it was pleasure, and pleasure, in a noble household, could be displayed. This did not mean that every medieval nobleman sat down to a table covered with sugar sculptures and extravagant cakes. That image belongs more to later periods and different culinary traditions. Medieval luxury had its own character. It might be expressed through beautifully prepared pastries, carefully arranged fruits, sweetened dishes, spiced preparations, rich almond mixtures, preserves, and imported ingredients. The presentation could be elaborate even when the basic food remained surprisingly recognizable. One of the most fascinating things about medieval banquets is the way familiar ingredients could be transformed. An apple was still an apple. But an apple cooked with honey, dried fruit, almonds, and precious spices belonged to another world. The ingredients had not changed completely, the experience had, and then there was the question of color. Before modern food coloring, cooks relied on natural ingredients to create visual variety. Certain fruits and spices could add different shades. Pastries could be shaped into decorative forms. The surface of a dish might be carefully arranged. A dessert could therefore appeal to the eyes before it ever reached the mouth. For guests seated at a long banquet table, this was part of the entertainment. The feast unfolded slowly. One course followed another. Servants appeared and disappeared. Dishes arrived from the kitchens. The room filled with aromas. And as the evening continued, the sweet foods brought a different mood. The heavier dishes had passed. The candles burned lower. The guests were comfortable, and the atmosphere became softer. Perhaps someone tasted a small pastry filled with fruit. Perhaps another tried a sweet almond preparation. Perhaps a guest encountered a flavor they had never experienced before, a spice from a distant land, a fruit from a warmer climate, a sweetness unlike anything available in their own village. For a moment, the entire world seemed to have been gathered onto one table, but beneath all this luxury was an uncomfortable truth. The abundance inside the castle depended upon the labor of people outside it. Farmers grew the grain. Workers harvested the fruit. Beekeepers tended the hives. Servants carried the wood. Bakers prepared the bread. Merchants transported the rare ingredients. The noble guest might see only the finished dessert, but behind that single plate stood hundreds of hands. And perhaps this is what makes medieval luxury so fascinating. A beautiful dessert could hide an enormous story, the story of trade, the story of labor, the story of privilege, and the story of hunger existing just beyond the castle walls. Yet not every celebration took place behind stone walls. For ordinary people, sweetness had its own place in the calendar. The village did not need imported sugar or exotic spices to celebrate. Sometimes all it needed was a good harvest, a warm fire, and enough food to share. So we leave the candlelit castle behind. The great doors close softly, and somewhere in the distance, we hear music, not from a noble hall, but from a village gathering beneath the open evening sky. And there, among ordinary people, another kind of dessert is waiting, one made not to impress kings, but to bring an entire community together. The castle is quiet now, the last candles are burning low, and the great hall has returned to darkness. Beyond the stone walls, however, the night is not yet still. A distant sound travels across the countryside. First, a drum, then a pipe, then the sound of voices rising together. The road leads us away from the castle and back toward the village, where something important is happening. There are no towering walls here, no expensive tapestries, no silver dishes waiting beneath candlelight. Instead, there is an open space near the village houses, surrounded by wooden buildings and fields that disappear into the darkness. A small fire burns at the center. People are gathering. Tonight is a celebration. And for ordinary medieval families, celebrations offered something that daily life often could not: a reason to stop worrying. At least for a little while, life in a medieval village could be uncertain. Harvests depended upon weather, animals could become sick, work followed the seasons, winter could stretch on for months, most meals were practical, most days were filled with necessary tasks. But certain moments broke through that routine: a wedding, a successful harvest, a local fair, a religious feast, the return of someone who had been away. These occasions brought people together, and whenever people gathered, food followed. The village celebration did not need a banquet filled with imported spices. It needed enough for everyone. Families might bring what they could. One household might contribute apples, another might bring a basket of berries, someone else might have honey, a prosperous farmer might provide eggs or nuts. The ingredients were combined according to what was available, and slowly, the ordinary became something special. Imagine a long wooden table placed beneath the evening sky. There are bowls of fruit, fresh bread, small cakes. Perhaps a simple pie. Nothing is perfectly arranged. Nothing looks identical, but the table is full, and that matters. For a family that normally counted every loaf of bread, seeing so much food gathered in one place could feel extraordinary. Children would notice the sweets first. They might stand at the edge of the gathering, watching adults prepare the food. Perhaps there is a honey cake cooling on a wooden board. Perhaps dried fruits have been mixed with nuts. Maybe someone has made a simple pastry filled with apples. The children wait. They know the food is not yet ready, but the smell is already there, sweetness drifting through the cool evening air. And perhaps one child becomes impatient. A hand reaches toward the table. An older relative gently pushes it away. Not yet. Soon. The anticipation becomes part of the experience, because when sweet foods are rare, waiting for them can be almost as memorable as eating them. Finally, the first piece is cut. It is not large. There is not enough for everyone to have an enormous portion, but the slices are shared. One by one, a child receives a piece, then another. The adults take their portions, and suddenly, the entire village is participating in the same small pleasure. This is one of the great differences between noble feasts and village celebrations. The noble banquet could demonstrate wealth, the village celebration demonstrated community. The dessert did not need to be exotic, its value came from the people gathered around it. A simple honey cake could become unforgettable when eaten beside friends and family. A handful of dried fruit could feel luxurious when shared after months of ordinary meals. The food became connected to memory. Years later, someone might remember the taste of apples baked with honey, but they might remember something else even more clearly. The sound of music, the warmth of the fire, the voices of neighbors, the feeling of being surrounded by people who had shared the same difficult year. This emotional connection may explain why festive foods appear so often in historical traditions. They mark time. They tell people that one season has ended and another has begun. The harvest has been gathered. The wedding has taken place. The long winter has finally passed. A celebration is a pause. A moment when people can enjoy something unnecessary, and that is precisely what makes dessert meaningful. It is not required for survival. You can live without a honey cake, you can survive without a sweet pastry, but when life is difficult, people still create small moments of pleasure, perhaps especially then. The village celebration also offered ordinary people the chance to experience flavors that were not part of their everyday lives. A family might save its best honey, someone might have gathered berries during the summer, fruit carefully preserved through autumn could finally be opened, a few nuts might be cracked and shared. Every ingredient had a story, and when combined, those stories created a feast. The night grows darker. The music becomes softer, the The fire settles into glowing embers. Children who were once full of energy begin to grow tired. Some lean against their parents, others sit quietly near the warmth. The remaining sweets are covered and saved. Tomorrow, ordinary life will return. There will be work again. The fields will need attention. The animals will need feeding. The ovens will need lighting. But tonight, there was sweetness, and for a few peaceful hours, that was enough. Yet the village calendar contained celebrations far more important than weddings or harvests. Some of the greatest gatherings were connected to faith. Across medieval Europe, religious festivals shaped the rhythm of the year, and these holy days brought their own special foods, their own traditions, and their own forms of sweetness. As the village fire slowly fades, the road ahead leads toward a church glowing softly beneath the night sky. Inside, another celebration is beginning, and with it comes a question that medieval cooks had to answer again and again. What should a person eat when ordinary rules of life are temporarily changed? The answer would create some of the most fascinating festive foods of the medieval world. The village celebration has almost disappeared into the night. The last embers glow softly beneath a layer of ash, and the voices that filled the square have become distant whispers. But one building remains quietly illuminated, the village church. A warm line of candlelight spills through its narrow windows, touching the cold stones outside. Inside, the rhythm of the medieval year is being marked once again. For medieval people, religion was not simply something practiced on special days. It shaped the calendar, it influenced work, it guided meals, and it determined when certain foods could be eaten and when they had to be avoided. This created a fascinating relationship between faith and food. For much of the year, people followed familiar patterns, but when a major religious festival arrived, the ordinary rhythm could change, and with it came special meals, special ingredients, and sometimes special sweets. Imagine the approach of Christmas in a medieval village. The cold has settled over the countryside. The fields are quiet. Trees stand bare against a pale winter sky. Inside the cottages, families gather around fires. Preparing for the celebration, food is being collected. Grain has been stored. Fruit that was carefully preserved months earlier is brought out. Nuts are cracked open, honey is measured, the best ingredients are saved for the occasion. For many ordinary families, a religious festival offered a reason to use food that might otherwise remain untouched. The sweetest ingredients were not necessarily available every day, but a holy celebration was different. It was a moment when people could allow themselves something special. The food became part of the meaning of the day. A sweet dish was not merely something to satisfy hunger, it represented abundance, generosity, and celebration. This was especially important in a society where daily life could be difficult. A religious festival created a pause in the ordinary struggle. The work did not disappear, the cold did not disappear, but the day itself felt different. The table might be fuller, the fire might burn longer, and something sweet might appear. Yet religious traditions could also make food more complicated. Medieval Christians observed periods of fasting and abstinence. During certain seasons and on particular days, people were expected to avoid specific foods. Meat was often restricted during fasting periods. And in some traditions, other animal products could also be limited. This meant that cooks had to become inventive. The challenge was simple. How do you prepare something satisfying when some of your usual ingredients are unavailable? The answer often involved substitutions. Almonds could become especially useful. Ground almonds could create rich textures. Almond milk could replace dairy in certain preparations. Nuts and seeds could provide nourishment. Dried fruits could add sweetness. Honey could bring flavor, and spices could make simple ingredients feel more luxurious. The result was sometimes surprisingly sophisticated. Imagine a medieval kitchen during a fasting period. The cook stands beside a wooden table. There is no butter available for the recipe, no fresh milk, perhaps no eggs. Instead, there are almonds soaking in water, dried fruit sit in a bowl, honey waits in a small clay jar, a few spices are arranged nearby. The cook begins to work, the almonds are crushed, the mixture becomes smooth, fruit is added. Honey follows, then comes a little spice. Slowly, the ingredients become something new, a dish created not because the cook had every ingredient they wanted, but because they had learned how to work with what was permitted. This is one of the fascinating things about medieval food traditions. Restriction did not always eliminate creativity, sometimes it encouraged it. When people are told they cannot use one ingredient, they begin searching for another, and over time, those substitutions can become traditions of their own. Religious festivals also created opportunities for regional differences. A celebration in one part of Europe might feature a particular sweet bread. Another region might favor fruit pastries. Elsewhere, nuts and honey could dominate. Local ingredients shaped local customs. The religious calendar was shared across enormous distances, but the food served on those days could be completely different. This gave medieval festivals a remarkable variety. The same holy occasion could produce different flavors depending on the landscape. In a region surrounded by vineyards, dried grapes might appear. Near orchards, apples and pears might become central. Where almonds were available, they could be transformed into rich festive foods. Where honey was abundant, it became the natural source of sweetness. The festival table therefore reflected both faith and geography. And then there was the emotional side. For a child, a religious festival might be remembered through food. Perhaps there was a sweet cake that appeared only once a year. Perhaps the child knew that when the festival arrived, a familiar smell would fill the house: honey, warm fruit, baked dough, spices. The memory could last for decades. Even after the child became an adult, the smell of that food might bring back the feeling of sitting beside a warm fire while winter pressed against the windows. Food has a strange relationship with memory. Perhaps that is why festive desserts have survived so well. They are not simply recipes. They are reminders of family, of community, of a particular season, of a time when the ordinary world briefly became something different. But medieval cooks were not always successful. The kitchen was a place of experimentation. Ingredients could be misunderstood, measurements could be guessed, ovens could burn, and sometimes a dessert could go terribly wrong. The next morning, we will step into the darker side of medieval baking, because behind every delicious success was the possibility of a forgotten failure, a dish that collapsed, a pastry that burned, or a recipe that sounded wonderful in theory, but became something almost unrecognizable when it finally emerged from the oven. And somewhere in a medieval kitchen, a cook is about to discover exactly how strange dessert can become when things do not go according to plan. The church bells have grown quiet now, the candles inside the village church have burned low, and the families who gathered for the religious festival have slowly returned to their homes. Outside, the night is cold, but somewhere nearby, behind a thick wooden door, there is still a warm glow, a kitchen fire, and around that fire, someone is having a difficult evening, because for all the skill of medieval cooks, kitchens were places where things went wrong, quite often. There were no precise electric ovens, no digital scales, no carefully printed instructions explaining exactly how long something should bake. A cook had to rely on experience, and experience, as anyone who has ever cooked knows, sometimes comes from failure. Imagine a medieval baker preparing a special sweet pie. The ingredients have been gathered carefully: apples, dried fruit, honey, nuts, a little spice. The pastry has been rolled. The filling has been placed inside. Everything seems perfect. The pie goes into the oven. Then the cook turns away. There is other work to do. Bread needs attention. A pot is boiling. Someone needs more firewood. A servant has arrived with another basket of ingredients. Time passes, and then a smell begins to spread through the kitchen. Not the warm fragrance of baked apples, not the gentle sweetness of honey, something darker, something bitter, burning. The cook suddenly remembers the pie. The oven door is opened, smoke pours outward, the crust is blackened, the edges have collapsed, the filling inside has become sticky and dark, the dessert is ruined, perhaps, but medieval cooks were not always quick to throw food away. Waste was expensive. The cook might scrape away the worst of the burned crust. Perhaps the filling could still be used. Perhaps the pie could be cut into pieces. Maybe no one would notice. This practical attitude was part of everyday medieval life. Food represented labor. Every grain of flour had been grown, harvested, transported, and milled. Every egg had come from an animal that needed to be fed. Every spoonful of honey required the work of bees and beekeepers. A failed dessert was therefore more than a disappointment. It represented wasted resources. So, cooks learned to improvise. A mistake could become a new dish. A burned piece of bread might be dried and used in another preparation. Overripe fruit could be cooked down. A broken pastry could be transformed into something else. The medieval kitchen was full of second chances, but not every mistake could be rescued. Sometimes the problem began before the cooking even started. Ingredients could spoil, milk could sour, fruit could rot, nuts could become rancid. A cook had to know the difference between food that was simply old and food that had become dangerous. This was not always easy. There were no modern labels showing expiration dates. No refrigerators slowing the process of spoilage, no scientific tests performed in the kitchen. Instead, people relied on their senses: smell, texture, appearance, taste. Sometimes those senses were enough, sometimes they were not. A sweet dish could hide problems. Honey and spices might cover unpleasant flavors. Strong ingredients could disguise the early signs of spoilage, and a cook who wanted to avoid wasting precious food might be tempted to use something that should have been discarded. Then there was the problem of measurement. Modern recipes often tell us exactly how much of each ingredient to use. Medieval recipes could be far less precise. A cook might be told to add enough honey, a handful of nuts, a little spice, a suitable amount of flour. These instructions made sense to someone with experience. But imagine a young apprentice trying to follow them. How much is enough? How large is a handful? How much spice is too much? The answer depended on the person, and that meant two cooks could prepare the same recipe and produce completely different results. One might create a delicious pastry, another might produce something dry, bitter, or overwhelmingly spiced. The oven created even more uncertainty. Fire behaves differently from modern controlled heat. The temperature could rise quickly. Wood could burn unevenly. One side of the oven might be hotter than another. A pastry placed too close to the fire could burn while another remained undercooked. The baker had to learn the personality of the oven. Every oven had one. Some were fierce, some were slow, some held heat beautifully, others lost it too quickly. The most experienced bakers could judge these differences almost instinctively, but even they made mistakes, and sometimes those mistakes became memorable. Imagine a noble banquet. Servants are carrying dishes into a great hall. The guests are waiting. The final dessert arrives. Everyone expects something impressive. The cover is lifted. Silence. The pastry has collapsed. Perhaps the filling has leaked through the crust. Perhaps the decorative surface has broken apart. the cook stand somewhere in the kitchen, waiting anxiously for the reaction. Would the guests complain? Would the Lord be angry, or would everyone simply eat it anyway? We will never know how many medieval desserts failed in kitchens across Europe. Most were probably forgotten. They left no record, no manuscript, no recipe. No historian ever wrote down the story of the burnt pie that disappointed a room full of nobles, and yet, these invisible failures are part of the history of food. Because every successful recipe is built upon countless unsuccessful attempts. The medieval dessert table may look elegant when we imagine it from a distance, but behind every perfect pastry was a kitchen filled with smoke, tired workers, uncertain measurements, and occasional disasters. Perhaps that makes the surviving recipes feel more human. The cooks who prepared them were not machines. They guessed, they adjusted, they learned, they made mistakes, and sometimes they created something wonderful by accident. The fire in the kitchen is beginning to settle now. The smell of smoke is fading, and on the wooden table sits a dish that, despite all expectations, turned out beautifully. Its surface is golden, its fruit is soft, its fragrance is warm with spice. Looking at it today, we might imagine that medieval desserts were always strange and unfamiliar, but the truth is more surprising. Some of them may have looked, and even tasted, remarkably close to things we still enjoy. The next step in our journey brings us to those forgotten sweets that might not seem so ancient after all, because beneath the dust of centuries, some medieval desserts are waiting quietly to be recognized. The kitchen has finally grown quiet, the failed pastries have been cleared away, the oven has cooled, and the last traces of smoke have disappeared into the darkness, but on the wooden table, one small dish remains. It looks surprisingly familiar, a golden crust, soft fruit, a gentle dusting of crushed nuts, the faint fragrance of cinnamon. For a moment, it is easy to forget that we are looking at food from hundreds of years ago. Because some medieval desserts would not seem strange to us at all. In fact, if one of these dishes appeared on a modern table, you might reach for a spoon without giving it a second thought. The most familiar examples often begin with fruit. Apples have been transformed into sweet dishes for centuries. Medieval cooks understood the simple pleasure of taking fruit from the orchard and changing it through heat. A fresh apple could be crisp and tart, but once it was sliced, cooked, and combined with honey or dried fruit, it became softer, warmer, richer. The natural sweetness intensified. The texture changed completely, and suddenly, a simple piece of fruit had become something that felt like a dessert. The same was true of pears. During the right season, a medieval kitchen might have an abundance of them. Some were eaten fresh, others were stored, and some were cooked until tender. A pear could be paired with honey, nuts, or spices. The ingredients were simple, but the result could feel remarkably sophisticated. Imagine a bowl arriving at the end of a meal. Inside are warm pears. Their surfaces glisten slightly, a little honey has been added. Perhaps there is a subtle fragrance of cinnamon. The dish is served warm. The first bite would not seem entirely foreign to us. The flavor is ancient, but the pleasure is familiar. Then there are the pastries. Although medieval pastry was different from the delicate, perfectly uniform products found in modern bakeries, the basic idea remains recognizable. Flour, fat, fruit, heat. The transformation of these ingredients into something golden and fragrant is one of those culinary ideas that seems almost timeless. A medieval fruit pie might have a rougher crust than the pies we know today. The edges might be uneven, the filling might not be perfectly balanced, but underneath the imperfections is something comforting, warm fruit enclosed in pastry. It is difficult to imagine a world in which that combination would ever become completely unfamiliar. And then there are almond-based sweets. These may be among the most surprising because they can resemble modern confections in texture and appearance. Ground almonds can be transformed into a smooth paste. Honey can add sweetness. Rosewater can introduce a delicate floral fragrance. The mixture can be shaped into small pieces or used as part of a larger preparation. The result may remind us of certain modern nut-based sweets. Different cultures have their own versions, different names, different traditions, but the basic idea of turning nuts into something rich and sweet is remarkably old. Perhaps this is one of the reasons food history feels so intimate. We often imagine the past as completely foreign. We picture strange clothing, unfamiliar buildings, different languages, yet the moment we sit down at a medieval table, some of the distance disappears. A person from the 13th century might have enjoyed the same basic pleasure we feel when biting into a warm pastry. They might have loved the smell of baked fruit. They might have waited impatiently for a cake to cool. They might have preferred one sweet dish over another. The ingredients may differ, the technology may differ, but the experience of enjoying food is surprisingly persistent. This is especially true with honey cakes. Their exact recipes varied greatly, but the basic concept is easy to understand: grain, honey. Perhaps eggs or dairy when available, maybe nuts, maybe spices. The mixture is baked. The result becomes something that can be shared. Even the idea of sharing a cake feels familiar. A special food is placed on the table, someone cuts it, the first piece is given away. Everyone waits for their turn. The moment becomes part of the memory, and perhaps that is why some medieval desserts feel less like historical curiosities and more like distant relatives of foods we still eat. They remind us that culinary traditions do not disappear completely. They change, they adapt, they travel. A recipe may cross a border, an ingredient may be replaced, a cooking method may evolve. But the original idea can survive. The medieval cook wanted to make fruit sweeter, wanted to preserve it, wanted to create something comforting, wanted to impress guests, wanted to celebrate. Those desires have not vanished. We still have them, yet not everything served in a medieval kitchen would make us feel at home. For every warm fruit pie that seems comforting, there were dishes that might leave us staring at the plate in confusion. Some combinations would seem unusual, some ingredients would be difficult to recognize, and some desserts might look so strange that we would hesitate before taking the first bite. The medieval world had its own ideas about what was beautiful, what was appetizing, and what belonged on a feast table. So as we admire these surprisingly familiar sweets, another table is waiting nearby. The candlelight is dim, the serving dishes are covered, and beneath one of those covers is something that might have been considered perfectly delicious centuries ago, but today, perhaps not quite so inviting. The next dish is waiting, and this time, the mystery is not whether medieval people enjoyed it. They certainly did. The question is whether we would be brave enough to try it. The familiar sweets are behind us now. The warm apple pie has disappeared into the darkness. The honey cake has been carried away, and the gentle fragrance of almonds and cinnamon still seems to linger in the cold medieval air. But not every sweet dish from the Middle Ages would make us feel quite so comfortable. Some would look strange, some would seem unsettling, and a few might make us pause before taking the very first bite. This is partly because medieval people did not divide food into the same neat categories that we do today. Modern diners often expect dessert to arrive at the very end of a meal. We imagine something clearly sweet, perhaps a cake, a pudding, a pastry, a bowl of fruit, but medieval meals could be much less predictable. Sweetness might appear alongside ingredients that we would normally associate with savory food. Spices could move freely between different kinds of dishes. Fruit might be combined with meat, nuts could appear almost anywhere, and ingredients that seem completely out of place to us could become perfectly acceptable when prepared by a skilled cook. Imagine sitting at a medieval banquet. The room is warm. Candles flicker against stone walls. A servant places a dish in front of you. At first, it looks beautiful. The surface is decorated carefully. There are dried fruit scattered across it, perhaps some nuts. The aroma is sweet. You take a closer look, and then you notice something unexpected. The dish contains meat. Maybe small pieces have been mixed with fruit and spices. Perhaps the preparation is sweetened with honey or another source of sweetness. To a medieval guest, this might not seem strange at all. To us, it could be deeply confusing. The medieval palate was comfortable with combinations that modern food culture often keeps separate. Sweet and savory were not enemies. They were simply flavors. A cook could bring them together if the result was pleasing, and this approach created some unusual possibilities. Imagine a preparation containing dried fruit, spices, nuts, and meat. The fruit provides sweetness, the spices add warmth, the nuts give texture, the meat brings richness. Everything is combined into a single dish. There is no clear line between dinner and dessert. The dish simply belongs to the meal, and then there were the textures. Medieval cooks did not have modern food processors, yet they were perfectly capable of grinding ingredients into pastes. Nuts could be crushed, seeds could be pulverized. Bread could be soaked and transformed, fruit could be cooked until it became soft. The result could be smooth and dense, perhaps even slightly sticky. For someone accustomed to modern cakes and creamy desserts, the texture might seem unfamiliar, but it was not necessarily unpleasant. In fact, texture was part of the appeal. A rich almond paste could feel luxurious, a thick fruit preserve could be intensely sweet. A dense honey cake could be surprisingly filling. The problem is often not taste, it is expectation. We look at a medieval dish through modern eyes. We expect a dessert to look like something we already know. When it does not, our minds immediately decide that it must be strange. But imagine the reverse. What would a medieval person think if they suddenly found themselves in a modern supermarket? Rows of brightly packaged sweets, artificial colors, chocolate bars, gummy candies, frozen desserts, dozens of varieties of cake. The sheer abundance might be more shocking than anything served at a medieval feast. A medieval person might wonder why anyone needed so many different forms of sweetness. Perhaps they would find our desserts just as strange as we find theirs. There were also ingredients that modern diners might find unsettling for other reasons. Certain medieval dishes relied heavily on animal products. Some sweet preparations could include ingredients that would not usually appear in modern desserts. The medieval kitchen was less concerned with keeping ingredients inside strict categories. If something was edible, available, and useful, it could find its way into the cooking pot. This practical attitude sometimes produced dishes that seem unusual today. But there is another reason some medieval desserts look horrifying to modern eyes: presentation. Food photography has changed our expectations. We are accustomed to desserts designed to look perfect: smooth surfaces, precise shapes, careful decoration. Medieval pastries were often much rougher. Their crusts could be uneven, their shapes could be irregular, their colors could be dull. A dish might be delicious while looking almost completely unappealing. Imagine a thick brown mixture sitting inside a rough pastry shell. The ingredients are hidden, the surface is cracked. There is no delicate decoration, no bright colors, no perfect symmetry, and yet, beneath the crust, the flavor could be rich and comforting. This reminds us of something important: food does not need to be beautiful to be good, and beauty itself changes with time. What one generation considers elegant, another may find unattractive. Medieval cooks had their own standards. They valued richness, rarity, fragrance, the appearance of abundance. A dish containing expensive spices could be impressive even if its color was dark and its shape uneven. A pastry filled with rare ingredients could be admired simply because those ingredients were difficult to obtain. The visual language of luxury was different, and sometimes, the strangest looking dishes were the ones that carried the greatest status. Yet perhaps the most unsettling thing is not what these desserts looked like. It is what they reveal about the medieval world. People were constantly adapting. They used whatever ingredients were available. They preserved food whenever possible. They combined flavors according to tradition, necessity, and imagination. Their kitchens were not laboratories filled with perfect recipes. They were places of improvisation, and from that improvisation came foods that might look horrifying to us, but were completely ordinary to them. Still, among all these unfamiliar dishes, one group approached food with a special kind of curiosity. Children, young medieval boys and girls did not care about culinary history. They did not wonder whether a dish was traditional. They simply wanted something sweet. And if a strange-looking dessert appeared in front of them, they might be the first ones brave enough to try it. The next morning, we will follow them into kitchens, into village streets, and toward the small, precious treats that medieval children waited for with the same impatience children have always known. Because sometimes, the simplest sweet is the one remembered for the rest of your life. The strange-looking desserts have been left behind, the dark pastries, unfamiliar mixtures, and unusual combinations slowly disappearing beneath the covers of wooden serving dishes. But somewhere nearby, a much smaller audience is waiting, a child, perhaps several of them. They have been watching the adults for what feels like an eternity. They have seen the honey being poured. They have watched the fruit being sliced. They have smelled the warm pastry coming from the oven, and now they are waiting for the one thing that matters most. Their share. For medieval children, sweet foods could carry a special kind of excitement, not because every dessert was elaborate, quite the opposite. The ordinary treats were often simple: a piece of fruit, a little honey, a sweetened piece of bread, perhaps a small cake prepared for a festival. The sweetness itself was the reward. Imagine a medieval village in late summer. The fields are warm beneath the afternoon sun. Beyond the cottages, blackberry bushes grow along the edges of a path. A group of children has discovered them. They move carefully through the bushes, picking the darkest berries. Some go into a basket, others disappear immediately. One berry for the basket, one for the child, another for the basket, another for the child. By the time they return home, the basket may be lighter than expected. But no one seems particularly concerned. The berries are eaten fresh, some might be saved, others could be cooked, perhaps a portion would be mixed with honey. The children might not understand the value of the ingredients, they only know that the fruit tastes sweet. And that is enough. For many medieval children, food followed the seasons. Their experiences were shaped by what grew nearby. In spring, there might be fresh greens and early fruits. Summer brought berries. Autumn offered apples, pears, nuts, and other harvest foods. Winter was different. The landscape became quiet. Fresh fruit disappeared. Stored foods became more important. Dried fruits might be carefully rationed. Preserved apples could be brought out. Honey might be used sparingly. This seasonal rhythm meant that children learned early that some foods were temporary. A fruit that seemed ordinary in September could become precious in January. A sweet treat available during harvest might not appear again for months. That made anticipation part of childhood. Imagine a young boy sitting beside a kitchen fire during winter. Outside, snow covers the ground. The trees are bare. Inside, his mother opens a small container. The child immediately recognizes what is inside: dried fruit, perhaps there is only a little, the portion is small, but the child's eyes follow every movement. One piece is placed into his hand, he holds it carefully. There is something fascinating about this moment. The treat is tiny, but to the child, it represents far more. It is sweetness during a season when sweetness is scarce. It is a memory of summer, a reminder of warmer days, and perhaps, for a few moments. Winter does not seem quite so long. Children also encountered sweets during special occasions. Birthdays, in the modern sense, were not necessarily celebrated in the same way across medieval society. But there were weddings, religious festivals, village gatherings, harvest celebrations, family occasions. These moments could bring special foods into a child's life. A child might not remember every ordinary meal, but they might remember the day a special cake appeared. They might remember the smell of honey, the warmth of the kitchen, the excitement of seeing a sweet dish placed on the table. The adults might discuss the ingredients. The children would simply wait, and waiting was often part of the pleasure. Because a medieval child did not have unlimited access to sweets, there were no shops filled with colorful candy waiting around every corner. There was no expectation that dessert should appear after every meal. Sweetness was occasional. This made it powerful. A small piece of honey cake could become a treasured memory. A handful of dried grapes could feel like a special gift. A warm apple pastry could become the taste associated with an entire season. And children were not always passive observers of food traditions. They could help prepare it. A child might gather berries, crack nuts, carry apples, turn a wooden spoon, watch the oven. These were small tasks, but they connected children to the food they eventually ate. They learned where ingredients came from. They learned how long preparation took, and perhaps most importantly, they learned that food was not guaranteed. Every loaf had required work, every apple had required a tree, every spoonful of honey had required bees, every sweet treat had a story behind it. This understanding may have made children appreciate food differently. Not always. Children are still children. A child who sees a honey cake may still want the biggest piece. A child may still sneak a taste before dinner. A child may still complain when told to wait. But the scale of the world was different. When sweets were rare, stealing one bite could feel like a great adventure. Imagine two children standing outside a kitchen. The door is slightly open. Inside, an adult is preparing a festive cake. The smell drifts into the courtyard. The children look at each other. They know they should wait. They also know that waiting is becoming increasingly difficult. One child takes a step toward the door. The other whispers something. Perhaps they decide against it. Perhaps they wait. Perhaps one tiny crumb somehow disappears. We will never know. The historical record rarely tells us these small stories. And yet, these are the moments that make the past feel alive. Children were not miniature adults. They were curious, impatient, playful, hungry, and fascinated by anything sweet. Their desserts might have been simpler than ours, but the emotion behind them was remarkably familiar. The excitement of seeing something special. The anticipation of the first bite. The disappointment when the portion was too small. The secret pleasure of eating something that was supposed to be saved for later. These experiences connect the medieval child to the modern child across centuries. Yet there was another side to medieval food that children could not always understand. Some ingredients were not merely rare, they could be dangerous. A substance that looked harmless might cause illness. A poorly prepared food could become deadly. And in a world without modern food safety knowledge, even a sweet dish could carry hidden risks. The child sitting beside the warm kitchen fire would not know this. They would only see the dessert, only smell the honey. Only wait for the first bite, and sometimes, The danger was hidden where no one could see it. The child is still waiting beside the warm kitchen fire, a small piece of honey cake resting in their hands, its sweetness completely innocent to them. But the medieval kitchen holds secrets that the child cannot see. Not every danger announces itself. Some dangers are hidden in a jar, others grow quietly in the pantry, and some can appear when a harmless ingredient is prepared in the wrong way. The medieval world had an enormous knowledge of plants, foods, and traditional remedies. But this knowledge was uneven. People understood many dangers through experience. They knew that certain berries should not be eaten. They knew that spoiled food could make a person sick. They knew that some mushrooms were safe and others were not. Yet they did not understand the microscopic causes of food poisoning in the way modern science does. There were no laboratories examining contaminated ingredients, no refrigeration systems slowing bacterial growth, no printed safety instructions attached to every package. Instead, people depended heavily on observation, and sometimes observation was not enough. Consider the medieval pantry. It might be cool and dark. Sacks of grain sit against the wall, jars of honey rest on wooden shelves, dried fruits hang from strings, nuts are stored in baskets, flour is kept carefully away from moisture. To modern eyes, it might appear peaceful, almost safe, but food can change without announcing it. Grain can become contaminated, nuts can spoil, fruit can develop mold, a jar can become dirty, and if a cook does not recognize the problem, the ingredient may still find its way into a meal. One of the most dangerous problems involved grain. Medieval societies depended heavily on cereals such as wheat and rye. These grains were essential. They became bread, porridge, pastry, and countless other foods. But under certain conditions, grains could become contaminated by naturally occurring fungi. Some of these contaminations could cause serious illness. People did not understand the biological process behind it. They only knew that sometimes, after eating certain foods, people became terribly sick. The connection between the food and the illness was not always obvious. Imagine a village after a poor harvest. Food supplies are limited. The grain available is precious. A few darkened grains might be noticed among the others. Perhaps someone suggests removing them. Perhaps the grain is used anyway. There is little choice. The flour is milled. The dough is prepared. Bread is baked. And eventually, the meal is served. No one at the table knows what might be hidden inside. This was one of the quiet dangers of food in the medieval world. Necessity could force people to take risks. A wealthy household might have better access to fresh ingredients. A poor family might not. When food was scarce, throwing something away could feel impossible, and this applied to sweet foods as well. A cook might try to rescue damaged fruit by cutting away the worst parts. Spoiled ingredients could be hidden beneath honey or spices. An old mixture might be reheated. Sometimes this worked, sometimes it did not. The desire to avoid waste could create dangerous decisions. There were also plants. The medieval countryside was filled with wild vegetation. Some plants were edible, some were useful as medicines, others were poisonous. A person who knew the landscape well might recognize the difference, but mistakes could happen. Children were especially vulnerable. A bright berry could look inviting, a colorful plant might appear harmless. Without modern botanical knowledge, identifying every species correctly was difficult. The danger was not always obvious, and perhaps that is what made certain ingredients so frightening. They could resemble something safe. A poisonous plant might grow beside an edible one. A dangerous mushroom might look similar to a harmless variety. The difference could be subtle. One mistake could have serious consequences. Even familiar ingredients could become risky under certain circumstances. Honey, for example, was an important source of sweetness, but the safety of any food depended on how it was handled and stored. Contamination could occur, containers could become dirty, water used in food preparation might not be clean. The medieval kitchen was a place where many things were constantly being touched, moved, heated, and reused. Cleanliness mattered, but the understanding of germs did not yet exist. People knew that some food spoiled, they knew that certain smells meant danger, but they could not see the invisible organisms responsible for many illnesses. This created a strange contradiction. Medieval cooks could be extremely careful, they could preserve food expertly, they could distinguish ingredients through years of experience, and yet, they were still vulnerable to dangers they could not see. Perhaps the most unsettling example was mold. Today, we understand that some molds are harmless while others can produce dangerous substances. Medieval people did not have this knowledge. If a piece of bread developed a small patch of mold, someone might simply cut it away. If fruit became damaged, the spoiled section might be removed. Sometimes the rest of the food was perfectly fine, sometimes it was not. The line between safe and dangerous was difficult to see. And then there were the medicines. Medieval households often kept plants and substances that were believed to have healing properties. Some were genuinely useful, others were dangerous. A substance that could be medicinal in a carefully controlled amount might become poisonous in a larger one. This knowledge was often passed through tradition. Recipes were copied, advice was shared, experience was valued. But mistakes could be deadly. The medieval kitchen therefore existed between two worlds. It was a place of comfort and danger, a place where honey became cake, where fruit became pie, where spices became sweetness, but also a place where one wrong ingredient could change everything. And perhaps this makes the desserts we have been exploring feel even more remarkable. When a medieval family sat down to enjoy a sweet treat, they were experiencing the result of countless decisions. Someone had chosen the ingredients, someone had inspected them, someone had prepared them, someone had judged the heat of the oven. Someone had decided when the food was ready. The final dessert was not simply a recipe, it was the product of knowledge, experience, and sometimes luck. The child beside the hearth finally takes a bite. The honey cake is sweet, warm, safe. For this moment, nothing is wrong. The danger has passed unnoticed, leaving only the pleasure of the food. But elsewhere, behind the walls of a wealthy household, something far more extraordinary is being prepared. A dessert so expensive, so rare, and so difficult to obtain, that only a tiny number of medieval people could ever have tasted it. And when we finally discover what it was, we may understand just how far the medieval desire for sweetness could go. Because at the very top of the social world, dessert was no longer simply food. The kitchen has gone quiet again, the fire has settled into a bed of glowing embers, and the smell of warm honey and baked fruit has faded into the cold evening air. But somewhere beyond the village, behind thick stone walls and guarded gates, another kitchen is still awake. This is not an ordinary kitchen. The ingredients arriving here have traveled farther. The servants are more numerous, the cooks are more experienced. And the people waiting at the table expect something extraordinary. Tonight, we are entering the world of the medieval elite, where sweetness itself could become a display of wealth. It is difficult to name one single dessert as the most expensive of the entire medieval period. Recipes varied enormously across centuries and regions, and the surviving records rarely provide enough information to calculate an exact price, but we can identify the ingredients and preparations that would have been among the most costly, and at the center of that world was sugar. For most ordinary medieval families, sugar was not an everyday ingredient. It was expensive, it was imported, and it was difficult to obtain in much of Europe. sugar production existed in parts of the Mediterranean world, particularly in regions where the climate allowed sugarcane to grow, but getting sugar from the fields to a noble kitchen required cultivation, processing, transportation, and trade. Every stage added value. By the time it reached a wealthy household far from the places where it had been produced, it could be extraordinarily expensive. Imagine a small wooden chest being opened inside a castle kitchen. There is no mountain of sugar inside, perhaps only a modest quantity. The cook looks at it carefully. This is not an ingredient to be wasted. A little is measured, a little more is added. Every grain matters, and that alone tells us something about medieval luxury. The most expensive dessert was not necessarily the largest. It was not necessarily covered in decorations. Sometimes its luxury was hidden inside the ingredients. A small sweet dish containing sugar could be more prestigious than a much larger dessert made from ordinary honey. Then there were spices, cinnamon, ginger, cloves, nutmeg. These ingredients could travel extraordinary distances before reaching a European kitchen. Their presence on a table announced connections to distant commercial networks. A wealthy household could afford to use them not merely for necessity, but for pleasure. Imagine a cook preparing a rich almond-based sweet. The almonds have been ground into a smooth paste. Honey or sugar has been added. A small amount of rosewater brings a delicate fragrance. Then comes the spice, only a little, perhaps cinnamon, perhaps ginger. The cook mixes everything carefully. The result is not enormous, but it is rich, dense, fragrant, and extremely valuable. The dessert contains ingredients that ordinary villagers might rarely taste. Together, for the guest who receives it, the experience is about more than sweetness. It is about rarity. The dish represents distance, trade, labor, money, and access. This is why certain desserts became symbols of status. A noble host could serve foods that demonstrated what others could not obtain. The table became a kind of social language. The more unusual the ingredients, the more impressive the display could become. Yet there was another ingredient that could make a dessert especially valuable: fresh fruit from distant regions. Imagine a winter banquet in a wealthy household. Outside, the landscape is cold. The trees are bare, the fields are silent, but inside the great hall, a servant carries a dish containing fruit that has traveled from a warmer climate, perhaps citrus, perhaps another rare delicacy. The guests look closely. The color alone seems remarkable. It is a reminder that somewhere beyond the frozen countryside, there are places where the sun is still warm. To possess such fruit in the wrong season was a luxury. To serve it to guests was a statement. The same was true of preserved fruits. A household with access to sugar could create sweet preserves that lasted longer than fresh fruit. The process itself required valuable ingredients: fruit, sugar, containers, time, fuel, labor. The final product could be stored and served during special occasions. A small portion might be placed before a guest. It would not look enormous, but everyone at the table understood what it represented. A great deal of wealth had been concentrated into something very small. This is one of the strangest ideas in medieval food history. The richest dessert might be the one that looked the least impressive. A single spoonful of rare preserve, a small piece of sugar, sweetened confection, a few carefully prepared almonds, a rare imported fruit. To a modern person, the portion might seem disappointing, but in the medieval world, scarcity gave small things power. The less common an ingredient was, the more meaningful it became, and perhaps that is why sugar itself was so fascinating. At first, it was not simply another way to make food sweet. It was an exotic luxury, a substance associated with wealth. Over time, its availability would increase, its use would expand, and eventually, the history of sugar would become deeply connected to global trade and enormous changes in food culture. But during the medieval period, for those who could afford it, sugar represented something very different. Possibility, a cook could transform it into something that ordinary honey could not quite replicate. It could be shaped, preserved, combined with nuts, used in elaborate preparations, and perhaps most importantly, it could be displayed. Imagine the final course of a magnificent medieval banquet. The guests have eaten, the musicians have grown quieter, the candles burn low, a servant approaches carrying a small dish. Inside is a carefully prepared sweet. It contains sugar, almonds, spices, perhaps rare preserved fruit. The quantity is modest, but the room understands its value. No one needs to explain how expensive it was. The ingredients speak for themselves. And for a brief moment, the dessert becomes more than food. It becomes a portrait of the world that produced it, a world connected by merchants and ships, by farms and workshops, by distant climates and long journeys, a world where a handful of sugar could travel farther than most people ever would. But even the most luxurious dessert could not remain a symbol of exclusivity forever. The world was changing, trade was expanding. New ingredients were entering European kitchens, and the medieval relationship with sweetness was slowly beginning to transform. The small dish disappears from the table, the final candle flickers, and beyond the castle walls, ordinary people are still preparing their own simple sweets. Soon, the medieval world will begin to fade, and with it, an entire way of thinking about dessert. The age of rare sweetness is approaching its end, but the appetite for it is only beginning. The castle kitchen is quiet now. The expensive sugar has been carefully stored. The rare spices have been returned to their containers. The last dish from the banquet has been carried away, leaving only a few crumbs behind. For a moment, it seems as though nothing has changed, but beyond the castle walls, the world is moving, slowly at first, almost imperceptibly. The medieval age is beginning to disappear, and with it, the old world of sweetness is changing forever, for centuries. The experience of eating something sweet had been shaped by scarcity. Honey was valuable, sugar was rare, fresh fruit depended upon the season, spices came from distant lands. Even simple dried fruits could be precious during the coldest months. A sweet dish was therefore connected to time, to place, to wealth, to memory. But as the centuries passed, the ingredients that had once seemed extraordinary became easier to obtain. Trade expanded, merchants traveled farther, ports grew busier, new commercial connections linked distant regions. The world became increasingly connected, and the medieval dessert began to evolve. Sugar is perhaps the clearest example. At the beginning of our journey, sugar appeared almost like a treasure, a strange substance that had traveled great distances before reaching the kitchens of wealthy Europeans. A noble household might use it sparingly, a cook might measure it carefully. A small amount could transform an ordinary dish into something remarkable, but gradually, sugar became more familiar, its use expanded, its availability increased in some regions, and the meaning of sweetness began to shift. It was no longer only a symbol of extraordinary wealth. The change was slow. It did not happen overnight. A medieval villager did not suddenly wake up one morning surrounded by cakes and pastries. For generations, honey remained important, fruit remained seasonal, nuts remained valuable, but the direction of history had changed. Sweetness was beginning its long journey toward becoming something more common. And with that change came new possibilities. Bakers could experiment. Cooks could develop more elaborate recipes. Confectioners could create new forms of sweets. The boundary between medicine and food began to change as well. Sugar had once been valued partly for its perceived medicinal properties. Over time, its role as a source of pleasure became increasingly important. This was a subtle transformation. People had always enjoyed sweet foods, but now sweetness itself was becoming a larger part of culinary culture. The dessert course slowly began to take on a more recognizable identity, instead of simply serving sweetened foods among many other dishes. Cooks increasingly developed food specifically intended to be enjoyed at the end of a meal. The idea of dessert was becoming more distinct, and the medieval table was beginning to give way to something new. Imagine walking through a European town several centuries after the earliest scenes of our journey. The streets are still narrow. The buildings are still old, the ovens still burn with wood, but the food available in the marketplace has changed. There are more possibilities, more ingredients, more varieties. A merchant may carry sugar from distant regions, a baker may have access to ingredients that earlier generations could only dream about. The sweet tooth is becoming more ambitious, but there is something bittersweet about this transformation. As sweetness becomes more accessible, it also begins to lose some of the mystery that once surrounded it. The medieval child who received a small piece of honey cake might remember it for years. A modern child surrounded by sweets may barely notice one more. Abundance changes the meaning of pleasure. When something is rare, we pay attention. When something is everywhere, we can become accustomed to it. The medieval world understood sweetness as an event. Modern life often treats it as an option, yet the old traditions did not simply vanish, they survived in fragments. A method of preserving fruit, a recipe for a honey cake, a way of combining almonds and sweeteners, a preference for certain spices, a pastry technique passed from one generation to another. Food history rarely moves in a straight line. Recipes disappear, then return, ingredients change names, cooking methods evolve, but ideas survive, perhaps somewhere in a modern kitchen. A person is preparing an apple pastry that contains an idea first developed centuries ago. They may not know its history, they may not recognize the connection, but the tradition remains. This is one of the quiet mysteries of food. We often inherit things without knowing where they came from. A flavor can cross centuries without carrying a label. A recipe can survive even when the people who invented it are long forgotten. And perhaps that is why medieval desserts still matter, not because we should recreate every strange dish, not because every ancient recipe would taste wonderful, but because these foods reveal something about the people who made them. They show us what medieval people valued, what they considered rare, what they saved for special occasions, what they gave to children, what they served to guests, and what they dreamed of tasting. Sweetness was never simply about sugar. It was about hope, about celebration, about making ordinary life feel different for a little while. A village family could gather around a simple honey cake, a child could treasure a few dried berries, a noble could impress guests with rare spices and imported sugar. The ingredients were different, the circumstances were different, but the desire was the same, to experience something pleasant, something special. Something that made the passing of time feel a little kinder. And so, the medieval sweet tooth did not truly disappear, it transformed. The old world faded, the ovens changed, the ingredients became more accessible, the desserts grew more elaborate, but the ancient desire for sweetness continued moving forward. Through kitchens, through marketplaces, through family traditions, through generations of cooks, until eventually, the rare luxury of one age became the everyday pleasure of another. The medieval baker closes the oven door for the final time, the noble banquet hall falls silent, the village children return home, and somewhere, in the fading light of the old world, a final honey cake waits upon a wooden table. Perhaps it is simple. Perhaps it is imperfect. The medieval kitchen is quiet now. The fire has burned almost completely away. leaving only a few red embers glowing beneath the ash. The wooden tables are empty, the bowls have been washed, the spoons have been placed beside the hearth to dry, and somewhere in the darkness, the last scent of honey still lingers in the air. Our journey through the strange world of medieval desserts is almost over. For a little while, we have wandered through kitchens that existed hundreds of years ago. We have watched cooks measure precious sugar with careful hands. We have seen honey poured over warm cakes. We have followed children gathering berries beside village paths. We have imagined noble guests tasting spices that had traveled across distant lands. And we have discovered that sweetness, something so ordinary to us today, could once feel almost magical. Imagine returning to the village one final time. The celebration is finished. The tables have been cleared. The villagers have gone home. The narrow streets are silent beneath the night sky. A few windows still glow with candlelight. Behind one of them, a family is preparing for sleep. Perhaps there is a child lying beneath a rough wool blanket, still thinking about the sweet cake eaten earlier that evening. Perhaps the child remembers the taste, the honey, the fruit, the warmth. Perhaps the dessert was nothing remarkable by our standards, no elaborate decoration, no rich cream, no chocolate, no mountain of sugar, just a simple piece of food. And yet, to that child, it may have been perfect. This is one of the strangest lessons hidden inside the history of dessert. The value of a sweet thing does not always come from what it contains. Sometimes it comes from how rarely we experience it. A piece of fruit can become precious when winter has taken everything fresh away. A little honey can feel extraordinary when sweetness is difficult to find. A simple pastry can become unforgettable when it appears only once a year. The medieval world understood scarcity in a way that is difficult for us to imagine. Most of us live surrounded by choices. We can find something sweet at almost any hour. We can open a cupboard, visit a shop, order something from far away. Sweetness is everywhere, but perhaps that abundance has changed our relationship with it. When something is always available, we may stop noticing it. The medieval person had fewer choices, but perhaps, because of that, they noticed more. They noticed the first apples of autumn, the first honey of the season, the smell of bread entering the oven, the warmth of a cake cooling beside the fire. They waited. And because they waited, the reward meant more. Maybe that is why these old desserts still speak to us, not because every medieval recipe was delicious. Some were strange, some were expensive, some were probably disappointing, and some would look almost frightening on a modern table. But behind every recipe was a person, a cook standing beside a fire, a farmer carrying fruit home from an orchard, a child waiting patiently for a piece of cake, a merchant transporting spices across distant roads, a noble ordering an extravagant feast. Ordinary people, all of them trying, in their own way, to make life a little sweeter. And perhaps that is the real story. Not sugar, not honey, not spices. People who lived under very different circumstances, but who still understood something we understand today. That sometimes, a small pleasure can make a difficult life feel lighter. A warm meal, a familiar smell, a shared table, a sweet taste, something simple, something temporary, something that disappears almost as soon as it arrives. The centuries continue to pass. The medieval baker is gone. The village has changed. The castle walls have weathered. The old kitchens have fallen silent. But the recipes did not completely disappear. Some survived in manuscripts, some were changed by generations of cooks, some were carried into new countries, and some may still exist quietly in the foods we eat without realizing how far their stories reach. Perhaps when you taste a warm apple pastry, there is a distant echo of another kitchen. Perhaps when honey touches a piece of bread, You are sharing a flavor with someone who lived 800 years ago. The ingredients may be different, the ovens may be different, the world is certainly different, but the simple pleasure remains. And now, as our journey comes to an end, imagine that old village one final time. The moon is high above the rooftops, the fields are silver beneath the night. The church stands quietly in the distance. The last candle in the bakery has gone dark. Inside the homes, families are sleeping, the children have forgotten their worries, the cooks are resting, and somewhere, on a wooden shelf, a small piece of honey cake remains for morning, waiting patiently, just as it once waited for someone centuries ago. And perhaps there is something strangely comforting about that, because history often feels enormous. Kings, castles, empires, battles, great changes that reshape the world. But sometimes, the past is preserved in something much smaller, a crumb, a recipe, a forgotten flavor, a sweet taste shared between two people who never imagined that anyone would remember them. The medieval world is gone, but perhaps it is not as distant as we think, because people have always been hungry, they have always gathered around tables, they have always celebrated, they have always worried about tomorrow, and every now and then, they have always wanted something sweet. So tonight, as you slowly drift towards sleep, perhaps imagine yourself walking once more through that quiet medieval village. The road is empty, the air is cool, a faint smell of honey follows you through the darkness. Behind you, the old kitchen door closes softly, and the centuries begin to disappear. The castle fades, the village fades, the candlelight fades, until all that remains is silence and the faintest memory of sweetness. But here is one final thought to carry with you into the night. If something as simple as a dessert can survive hundreds of years, if a forgotten recipe can cross generations, if a single flavor can connect two people who lived centuries apart, then perhaps the past is never truly gone. Perhaps it is still hidden around us, in the foods we eat, in the traditions we keep, in the things we consider ordinary. And perhaps, without realizing it, we are still carrying pieces of the medieval world into our own lives. So close your eyes, let the old village grow quiet, let the fire become embers, let the final candle disappear, and as you drift into sleep, remember, the strangest thing about medieval desserts may not be how unusual they were, it may be how familiar they still feel. Good night. And perhaps, when you wake tomorrow, you may look at the simplest sweet thing on your table, and wonder how many centuries of human history are quietly hiding inside it.